Welcome to part 5 of my unpacking of Richard Flanagan's book Toxic. While I'll touch on a couple of other issues in this video, the main topics are freshwater and noise. Flanagan opens this chapter with the claim that Tasmanian waters have always been too warm to grow Atlantic salmon. And with warming ocean waters due to climate change, things will only get worse. He says that salmon suffer severe thermal stress above 17 degrees. From this shot from my video on fish physiology and stress, you can see that the optimum temperature for salmon growth is 16.5 degrees. This has been backed by Tasmanian-based scientific research out of IMAS. Hobart average seawater temperatures last year show less than 1 month when the temperature was above that 16.5 degrees. And this is data from 2020. Nevertheless, the broodstock salmon I observed here happily feeding at the Gaydon hatchery in Jindabyne, New South Wales on a 42-degree day with water temperatures of 24 degrees suggests that the thermal stress is not lethal. Every salmon ever farmed in Tasmania is descended from the fish from the Gaydon hatchery. Good genes, eh? And to future-proof that, CSIRO and other partners are engaged in selective breeding program to increase tolerance to warmer water. Atlantic salmon in Tasmania are likely to suffer from amoebic gill disease, where microscopic animals present in the water get trapped in their gills, aggravating an allergic response and causing a mucus buildup on the gills, restricting their ability to breathe. Think of it not so much as a disease, rather as something similar to when you accidentally breathe in some of those tiny bugs in summer. The treatment for AGD is to bathe the fish in fresh water. Flanagan calls this bathing for fish for AGD as flushing them in a soup of fresh water. I bet he's got that on tap. I have, at my house. Soup. Bit watery, needs salt. Flanagan says after bathing the fish in that soup of fresh water, quote, "The polluted fresh water is dumped into the marine environment used as commercial and recreational fisheries, and that the effects of dumping massive and growing amounts of polluted fresh water remain unknown, unmeasured and unreported." Firstly, polluted with what? The amoeba which were in the seawater already? Do you know how much freshwater surface runoff there is in Tasmania each year? Taswater estimates it to be 33,312,000 megalitres, or 33.3 billion tonnes. So how much freshwater does the salmon industry use for bathing? Flanagan says this is 1.96 million tonnes. He always compares salmon farm waste to human sewage. So let's compare salmon farming use of freshwater to human use of freshwater. Taswater says that the annual Tasmanian urban consumption of drinking quality water is 67 million tonnes. Salmon farming uses a mere 2.8% of that. Mindful of their use of freshwater, salmon companies have begun to utilise desalination techniques, extracting freshwater from seawater. Richard asks, quote, "Where and how is the highly concentrated toxic saline released?" Well, let's examine that. Desalination plants generally extract 20% of the seawater as freshwater. So from this 1 litre, you'd extract 200 mils of fresh water and you'd be left with 800 mils of toxic saline. But how much salt is that? In each litre of seawater, there's 35 grams of salt. Whoops, that attach more. 35 grams. So if we take out 20% of that as freshwater, there's 35 grams of salt in 800 mils. Bit windy. So exactly how toxic is that? So how highly concentrated is Richard's toxic saline? Well, the normal seawater has 35 grams per litre, which is 3.5% salt. Seawater residue from desalination, the 800 mils of water with that 35 grams of salt in it, is 4.4% salt. The Dead Sea is 28% salt. That sea is dead. There's no risk to ours. And how little even is the risk? Well, Melbourne Water's Victorian Desalination plant extracts 150 million tonnes of fresh water from the salt water of Western Port every year, therefore returning 750 million tonnes of Flanagan's toxic saline back into the ocean. It's not toxic, it has no detrimental effect, and in Tasmania, that 33 billion tonnes of freshwater runoff will most likely water it down. Don't you think? Well, here we are again in front of Tassal's Brabazon lease. The last time we were here, I didn't realise that this lease, in fact, is one of the most complained about in terms of noise. So let's just have a listen. And I should let you know that currently the feeders are in operation, which is perhaps one of the noisiest things that happens on a fish farm. So last time when we were here, not only did I not know that this was the most complained about site that Tassal has in the Huon River, but I also didn't know was just along the road from here, lives a woman whose life has apparently been destroyed by salmon farming. I'm not going to cause further embarrassment to the woman featured in Richard's book, so I'm not going to name her. But when she moved to this beautiful place by the Huon River on Cygnet Coast Road in 2005, the farm behind us had been there for at least 10 years. How do I know that? Because in 1995 I moved to a property on the other side of the Huon River at Police Point. And a year after that, my mother moved to the property directly above Tassal's Kalala farm. So I know what it's like to live by this river, and I know what it's like to hear the noise, or lack of, from salmon farms. But now the woman featured in Richard's book says before the farms arrived, she was fine. Well, farms were here 10 years before. But now, sadly, that woman feels that she can't continue with her happy existence by this coast. And that is really sad. But I'm wondering whether it says more about what she's been doing since she's arrived here than what existed before she did. The woman who bought a house next to an existing fish farm was pretty quick off the mark to start complaining about it. Many of these complaints are detailed in her 25-page submission to the Senate inquiry. In fact, if you want a synopsis of Richard's entire 200-page book, then read these 25 pages. Everything's here: freshwater, noise, Macquarie Harbour, water quality, everything. And interestingly, while Richard is happy to tell this poor woman's horror story, he doesn't once in his book reference her submission she wrote almost 7 years ago, where she detailed the effect on her health and her mental well-being. Let alone does he reference it in this chapter when he tells her story. But let's look at her activities. In 2008, together with her noise complaints, she did something really quite bizarre. When investigating a noise at her home, she decided that it was appropriate, and these are her words. In 2008, I was very disturbed by a not loud, in fact almost inaudible but insistent noise that seemed to waft around at night and seemed to come from the direction of the barge. I walked up to the land lease to see if I could pinpoint it better, and as the light was on, I walked down to the building and knocked. Nobody answered, and while I was waiting, I noticed 2 bags of feed on the dock. Out of curiosity, I thought I'd take a look at them to see if there was any information about the country of origin of the fish meal. The label announced it to be medicated purge feed. It is dated and signed off by a vet. The label displayed a warning that it's not for human consumption. It contained restricted animal material and was not to be fed to a range of domestic animals or other ruminants. I took a label off a bag that was being pushed around in the wind and went home. The following day, I phoned the health department as I was genuinely concerned that someone might take some of the feed itself and feed it to their animals. That's right. She trespassed on Tassal's property and stole some of Tassal's property and thought that other random people would do the same so they could feed stuff to their animals. Now, in 2010, she engaged the Environmental Defender's Office to submit on her behalf against an amendment to one of Tassal's leases in the Channel. She says here, and there's her address, 684 Cygnet Coast Road, Petchey Bay, Tasmania. Ms. has a view of Tassal's marine farming operations in the D'Entrecasteaux Channel from her residence. Well, let's just have a look at that, because here on Google Maps is 684 Cygnet Coast Road. And the lease in concern was either here or here. Because the Marine Farm Plan was now amended in 2019, 2010 amendments are no longer available for viewing. But for this woman to claim that from her residence here, she can see farming operations here or here, well, then you must question her honesty, because I live here and I can't see her place. Then, in 2015, she made her submission to the Senate inquiry, which we will return to. And in the submission, she claims that the culture of negligence has affected me in terms of my health and enjoyment of my place, my relationships, and has interfered with my productivity as an artist. But then, when the salmon companies rightfully responded to this 25-page tirade against them, citing a large amount of science and questioning the relevance of her claims, she then responded, claiming that when making a case, my submission is often helpful to provide historical references so as to put an issue in context. One learns this at university, as I did in the process of acquiring a science degree. So now she's a scientist. So with all this ongoing complaints and this reference to information years prior to her arriving there, and continually complaining to the salmon companies, is it any wonder that this woman is not exactly on Tassal's Christmas card list? But finally, let's have a look at noise complaints in total. This from Tassal's 2020 Sustainability Report, where it records their complaints received by the community. They received, remember, this is this horror company that is destroying our environment that everybody is opposed to. They received 13 complaints. One was about safety, one was about marine debris, and 11 were about noise. Now, of those 11, 2 noise complaints were made on behalf of community groups, and we'll visit one of those in a short while. And the remaining 9 noise complaints came from...
Well, here I am, about to catch the Bruny ferry and travel over to the dark side. From the ferry to Bruny, this is Tassal's shepherd's lease, about which the noise complaints have been made from the people across the channel at Calora. And here, on Bruny, is the Roberts Point lease, about which no complaints have been made. And just here is the official residence of the head of the association that has made the second most number of complaints about noise from salmon farms. Except it's not a residence, it's a shack, and on this beautiful Sunday afternoon there's nobody home. But there's people at work at the salmon farm just across the channel. We're at Richard's shack. The large waterway onto which the shack faced was famous for its scallops, its oysters and flathead. The water lost its clarity as more and more fish shit poured into the channel. More algae, more of the coastline rhymed with a bright green slime. Well, that water looks pretty clear to me. Those oysters look pretty healthy, and I can't see any slime. This is Calora, where a little cabal of the intelligentsia settles for recreation at the narrow spot on the channel, and is conflicted by one salmon farm and endeavours to close down an entire industry. And yet, listen how peaceful it is. And there's nobody here, because this is a community of shacks, not of residents. Whilst over here is a farm which employs people, generates income and feeds Australia. Richard reaches the peak of his conspiracy theories towards the end of this chapter, when he claims that noise has become a form of control by salmon companies over communities, and says that the use of noise in interrogation and torture is well documented. Noise does not have to be loud, only sustained to break its intended victim. So who is the intended victim? Salmon farms create noise as a process of feeding fish. They're not going out of their way to annoy people. He states that salmon companies deliberately taunt people with noise. But ironically, in a non-sublime message, Richard also says that sustained noise from opponents will break the industry. I reckon he's really proud of that one.
Now go away or I shall taunt you a second time.
Let's get away from the noise, eh? So that concludes part 5. At the end of part 4, I said I was thinking about getting some other voices to contribute, but I had second thoughts. I'm not paid by industry, I'm not influenced by industry, but opponents will leap to that conclusion, and I didn't want to give them any more ammunition by bringing in voices from industry, because I can be independent. I can say the things that industry can't say because they have to be polite. So I'd just like to end this one on an impolite note. To all those anti-salmon farming opponents who cheered and gloated online when 20 Tassal employees were injured in a workplace accident, you should be ashamed of yourselves. Go on, have a good, hard look at yourselves. See you next time.
I don't want to talk to you no more, you empty-headed animal food trough whopper. I fart in your general direction.